All right, that looks like everyone's on. Again, thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. Again, I'm Lauren Saliga, the head of the desk, and I'm joined by my fellow MISO analyst, Rush Milam. Also in the room with me is Jefferson Rhodes, the meteorologist for the MISO desk. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the box provided and go to webinar, and we'll be happy to answer those at the end of the broadcast here. Additionally, we will be making the slide deck and a recording of the presentation available to you via email should you or any of your coworkers not be able to join us at this point in time. So again, thank you for joining. To get started here, just a quick level overview of what we'll be doing today. First, we're going to be taking a look back at spring 2014, the couple months that were, look at some of the exciting things that might have happened and how that's going to build into the rest of the summer. Following that, we're going to do our weather and demand forecast for the summer. Following that up with a wind outlook, looking at generation changes within the footprint, then looking at the top constraint risk for summer, and then looking at some of the import-export issues that MISO has been addressing recently, most notably the MISO SPP seam issue and what that's meant for some of the congestion patterns we've seen in MISO recently, as well as a look at some of the changes to the PJM and MISO interface pricing. So to get started with our spring 2014 review, looking back, we were seeing a colder than average temperature in place throughout the footprint for the first 2 months of spring. Again, these anomalies were driven by a continued cold pattern in the upper Midwest, which helped to prolong the overall heating season. March, we saw a pretty decent peak here on Monday the 3rd at 96 gigs, while in April we were closer to 81 gigs. Heating degree days overall ran above average levels through the spring, with March and April showing pretty oppressive anomalies in the Midwest, but especially down in MISO South as well. Looking back at some of the price settles that we did have over the course of spring 2014, looking back at March, April, and May, average peak RTO demand was 80.3 in March, 74.3 in April, and then so far in May, 75.9. Looking at the average settles, we were looking around mid-50s for March, and then getting into April and May, you're dropping, coming down to the low 40s for April, and so far again averaging into the mid-40s for May. We're also looking at some of those peak Indy demand days, so again kind of getting into the mid-80s there. Average settles coming up for those days, March most notably reaching $100 for that settle. Looking back at the top constraints in the day ahead for spring 2014, a lot of Monticello East Winnemac hitting. Again, this due to longer-term work around Cumberland to Bush. You're also looking at strong central zone wind generation driving this. And then looking at summer 2014 and the likelihood to repeat, we are seeing some pretty decent risk here continuing to June, July, and August. Number 2 on our list here, Adams Transformer for Beaver Channel Harmony, Adams, and Rice. Looking at the hourly counts there at just over 1,000. Again, the average shadow price there around $89, and the most common month was in April. Looking at the drivers here, what we were seeing was line work around Alma, and then some generation outages around the area as we were kind of in the midst of spring maintenance season. Again, some risk there to continue into the summer, given some parallel line work that we're seeing now. Lastly, to round out the top 3, you are getting some of that Aurora Heights to Kellogg congestion posting. Again, the most common month so far this month in May. What you're seeing there is work around Poweshiek, as well as some weakness around coal-fired gen units in southern Iowa. Again, kind of keeping an eye on this area as well, as we're expecting some work here to continue into June. Now looking at the real time, again, no big surprises here. Monticello East Winnemac really kind of helping to drive the #1 spot again with almost 500 5-minute ticks here. The most common month again was in March, and same drivers here with the longer-term work around Cumberland to Bush and the strength in central zone wind. The number 2 spot, a new entry, South Bend to Blue Earth congestion hitting just over 300 times on the 5-minute basis. Another top constraint in March. What we were seeing there driving this constraint was long-term work at Lakefield, and then again strenger wind, especially coming out of the winter in MISO North. Some likelihood there to repeat, and we'll get into that a little bit further into the presentation. And then lastly, rounding up the top 3, another Adams Transformer posting, again with that work around Alma, kind of lasting here throughout the spring. Next up, taking a look at the seasonal demand and weather outlook forecast. For the summer, looking at 2014 for the Midwest, the temperature anomalies, again, no surprise for so far this year. We are seeing some below normals, especially for the upper Midwest. Above normals, a little bit more targeted around that southern portion of MISO, especially right on the Gulf Coast, looking at Louisiana and Texas hub, most notably impacted there. In terms of the precipitation for summer 2014, again, seeing some above normal conditions for the upper Midwest, a little drier to the south, again, most notably taking most of the MISO south footprint with it, and just keeping an eye on any kind of risk to see that move northward. Looking at some analog years here, most closely looking at 2009, there is some risk for this El Nino pattern to come in and again keep those cooler conditions concentrated over the Midwest and the Great Lakes. Looking at some of the historical weather trends for summer in MISO, what we have here is cooling low season, typically in full swing by June. Minneapolis really kind of the last of the pack to bring some of that cooling demand to the footprint. Outside of that, again, cooler temperatures still expected to center around the Great Lakes, so there is risk to see slightly weaker than average cooling demand days for Minneapolis and Indy, with the greatest demand downside for Detroit. Outside of that, again, seeing some of those cooling degree days above average around New Orleans, with the expectation for those warmer temperatures down in MISO South. Looking for another peak summer load in July, usually coinciding with the hottest temperatures kind of aligning across the footprint. Although it is worth noting that there is some risk that you see a non-coincidental peak between the Midwest and MISO South, given some of the warmer temperatures we're expecting in the South. Now getting into something we actually haven't looked at before for the MISO summer outlook is a tropics overview. Again, with the addition of MISO South back in December, definitely open up the footprint for a little bit of a change in meteorological phenomenon. So getting into this and our expectations here, we're really kind of seeing the heart of hurricane season between mid-August and late September, but it does officially kick off in a couple weeks here for the start of June. What we're typically seeing from MISO South is that kind of late August into late September period being the most active for the MISO South region. Now coming into the 2014 season, it doesn't look like the MISO coastline looks like it's overdue for hurricanes, in that kind of sense that we're looking at the historical average return period. So again, some of the risk there is that it will just take one storm, and I think the National Weather Service just came out with their slides today. You know, it does only take one storm to have a significant impact on load. Looking back to the most recent kind of hurricane to make landfall in MISO South was Hurricane Isaac. Here what we're seeing was the storm making contact on August 29th of 2012 on that Louisiana coastline. With that, we are seeing power outages, total in numbers up to the high hundreds of thousands. We were seeing demand destruction, which is kind of that drop-off you're seeing in the graph at the bottom of the chart here. And that's really a combination of things. You're seeing outages, evacuations, and cloud cover all kind of coming down and bringing the overall demand expectations down. So again, although MISO South isn't overdue for a hurricane, it will only take one to have a significant impact in the region there. So now getting into the wind forecast and what we're seeing there. Again, MISO South, MISO Summer, historically seeing the kind of drop-off in wind levels overall. The central zone not necessarily seeing as sharp a decline. The west seeing a pretty clear decline from the beginning of June to the end of August. Looking at some of the numbers more closely here in central and west, for max capacity in June in central you're on 33%. For the minimum you're on 5%. Through July you're about 29 down to 7. And then in central and August you're close to a 28 for a max and closer again to 5 for a min. Out in the west, a little bit more of a steep range. In June, between the max and min, you're at 64 for the max, the min closer to 17. July max around 38, the min closer to 6. And then in August, recovering slightly towards the end of the month, the max closer to 54, the minimum close to 3. So again, a pretty wide range, again, expecting that kind of drop off overall and kind of looking at closer to kind of 20 to 30% capacity factor in the west and closer to 20% capacity factor in the central zone. Now getting into some generation analysis in terms of retirements and new builds coming online. The only thing we are seeing here for the new generation side of things for the summertime was the addition of a 100 megawatt wind turbine in Madison, Iowa, currently under construction per the MISO generation queue. The in-service date currently targeted around August 15th of this year. Looking at the top constraint risk now, I'm going to turn things over to Rush to walk us through our top 5 constraints, as well as a recap of last summer's top constraints to kind of give us a threshold here for expectations.
Okay, so starting off going over the constraints from last summer. In the day ahead, you can see a couple of familiar ones to what we've seen so far this spring. However, a little change with that top, that Cumberland Bush, which that line is currently out of service, and that's actually scheduled to be out until June 30th. So with that, we're really looking at the second risk here, this Monticello East Winnemac. As we showed the real time here in a second, you'll see that that was one of the top ones as well. And for that, just looking at it, several outages around that Lafayette, Indiana area, as well as strong central zone wind. The next one up here is Newton Robinson. We've seen this, actually saw it in real time today, and just looking at some of those outages between that St. Louis and Indianapolis area, as well as some strong output for some of those coal units. Now, kind of moving over to the real time of last summer. The top one is the same. You're looking at that Cumberland Bush, so another one of those central zone wind risk. But the second one here, and we'll touch on this a little bit for the summer 2014 outlook, but it's Fox Lake Rupp. You had a couple of units around the Twin Cities that were actually down last summer that really impacted this. They've since returned, but definitely something to note later on. Now going to 2014 outlook, our first constraint here, this is actually one that we mentioned in our June FTR report, but it's Dresser to Allendale. For this, there's a couple of different factors we're looking at. The first one is we're expecting a coal-fired unit that's been down to return later this month. The second thing, as noted here, there are a few outages, the first of which are actually starting later on here in May, and they're around Bloomington, as well as some work starting there in June, going through July at Dresser to 8th Street. This is one of those ones that we really see on those really strong Indianapolis load days, kind of combined with all of those coal units up there in western Indiana. The next constraint risk is PPG Rose Bluffs. So looking there in MISO South, with this we can also add that Nelson transformer, which has been coming in the last few weeks really strong, both day ahead and real time. Kind of the reason for that, there are a couple of generators, one coal, one gas, that were supposed to come back. They've actually been extended through midsummer. So you're really seeing that pull there towards Texas. In addition to that, it looks like there's some line work, intra-month work there around Carlos, and then you have one from the 9th to the 11th at Nelson, just further adding to the risk in the area. The overall impact from this congestion is a continuation of the Texas hub premium over all the other MISO hubs. Next, we're moving to the southern Iowa area, and we're looking at the Ottumwa-Wapello constraint. This area, as Lauren mentioned earlier, we've seen a lot of congestion there in the spring, most notably the Aurora Heights congestion. We're actually expecting a reverse in that area and see more of that bearish Ottumwa variation. Kind of the main drivers, you do have a lot of line work scheduled there around Wapello, and then you have some work at Burlington, as well as the return of a coal unit in the area really driving that. This is definitely a greatest risk when you see those really strong load days in ComEd or any generation weakness there in central Iowa. Central Illinois. Next risk is Dickinson Lake Field. Last summer we saw a lot of the Fox Lake Rutland congestion, which is there in the same area, and we're looking for a similar pattern here this summer. Really looking at line work scheduled throughout most of the month of July at Lakefield and Nobles. This risk is greatest when you see a really strong wind there in that southwestern Minnesota area. But we've also seen this on some of those really strong load days there around the Twin Cities. So when we're waiting for some of that gas to come up online. And lastly, we're going to that Fowler area there in Indiana and looking at Honey Creek to Honey Creek Tap. This is the same constraint that's posted very strong the past couple of days here in the real time. And for that, we're really looking at that longer-term Cumberland Bush outage. Again, that's going through the end of June, so we definitely could see more of this. We're also really looking at that strong central zone wind driving this congestion.
Thank you, Rush. So getting just to the end of our presentation here and looking at the import-export changes we're seeing along the interfaces. First up, the MISO SPP dispute update. Looking at what we've seen so far since our last outlook, we haven't seen any major updates to the outcome of the dispute between MISO and SPP with regards to Section 5.2 of their JOA. So just kind of keeping an eye on that. However, MISO has taken some mitigating measures recently since they started getting billed from SPP. Most notably, they're now operating the flows between the Midwest and South to the physical limit that SPP claims of 1,000 megawatts. Additionally, what we saw was MISO in early April introduced a new constraint into the region, referred to as the sub-regional power balance constraint. What that means is this constraint is replacing ORCA and is helping MISO provide a better tool for managing the flows between the two areas. And then additionally, it is helping successfully limit the charges SPP has sent to MISO when this constraint first came into effect on April 12th. So what is a sub-regional power balance constraint? The power balance constraint is a generation to load constraint and not a transmission constraint. The ORCA interface were proxy flow gates that they are attempting to use to help control the congestion between the two regions. Now we're slowly relying on the risk and the kind of commitment levels in each of the regions. Additionally, the shadow price of the constraint is related to the percentage overflow of the physical line. So as soon as either direction, either Midwest to South or South to Midwest, begins to violate the limit of the line, this congestion should start to flag. And the stronger the shadow pricing, the more MISO is operating over that 1,000 megawatt threshold. Lastly here, when the congestion does hit, it does give the same overall impact to all the EP nodes in MISO South, but no MCC or marginal congestion component is seen in the Midwest. So that's something to just take note of. You do see kind of the price start to shift in the Midwest, but you're not seeing the MCC impact that's concentrated all in MISO South. Now, that's for all of the EP nodes. For the interfaces, though, we are seeing one kind of caveat here. Any region that has a single connection to MISO South, so areas like SoCo and AEC, are going to have the same sensitivity to that price constraint in MISO South. So they're going to be affected same as any generators in the region. However, any region with multiple connections to MISO, such as SPP or TVA, where the connection is to both MISO South and MISO Midwest, you are going to have a prorated sensitivity related to how much is dispatched between each of those regions. So you'll see a one-to-one for SoCo, for SPP and TVA. You're going to have a percentage of that. Now, what our expectations are for this summer for the sub-regional power balance constraint. Looking at last summer in the South and taking a look at generation less load, and our assumption was that of all of the generation available in MISO South, you'd see about 75% of that operating. And that was based on what the commitment levels looked like in MISO during the summer last year. The lowest generation minus load calculation was close to about 3.1 gigs, and that occurred on June 5th. Then looking overall at the top 10 occurrences with the tightest levels, which were all hovering around the 3 gigawatt level, 7 of them occurred in August, the rest were in June. Now, doing a similar study in kind of 75% of all generation commitment there, we are seeing a much tighter spread with multiple days in the Midwest under 1,000 megawatts. So what that means is, all of the top 10 occurrences for the Midwest also occurred in July. So using that and going forward into this summer, a couple expectations here. In July, we are expecting to see a Midwest kind of pull from the south, so a south to Midwest push, which is just going to be your power balance constraint coming in. So we are looking for those negative MCCs in the south to occur, and then some higher overall pricing to result in the Midwest. Coming out of the peak, though, we are expecting to see some of those flows revert to the more kind of pattern that we've seen recently, which is the Midwest pushing south, or the reverse power balance constraint. What that would mean was you would see some stronger MCCs in MISO South relative to what you were seeing in July. So again, looking at maybe some stronger prices going into August for MISO South relative to IndyHub. Next up are the pricing changes we're seeing for PJMC. Looking at the update there, and I think the PJM team yesterday mentioned the changes that were coming for the MISO interface point in PJM. PJM is set to use a 10-node interface definition for MISO. MISO, in return, has proposed a 9-node definition for the new PJMC. The new interface definition should better reflect the overall congestion around the seams, and it should be more efficient and give them a better way to kind of handle the dispatch between the two regions by reducing the occurrence of uneconomic flows. Yesterday, I know the PJM team presented that the new MISO interface point would be cheaper with the new points versus what the actual MISO interface price was last summer. Our expectation was that with those price calculations, you would see some stronger, potentially stronger imports from PJM into MISO with a cheaper source. So the 9 nodes here that MISO is potentially using include the Cook Unit, Zimmer, Miami Fort, Powerton, and Kincaid. So all of these units kind of focus directly in MISO, or kind of in the more intermingled regions. Previously, when we presented on PJMC and the placement of the nodes, it was concentrated much more heavily on the eastern side and the kind of eastern seaboard parts of PJM or PJM Classic. So this should have a change in the impact in pricing, but again, MISO is still working through some of those, so maybe a little bit behind in changing their interface price. So now just to wrap up our summary for summer 2014, coming out of a cooler than average spring, we expect to see the cooler conditions continue for the Midwest, while we're still seeing some of those southern portions of the footprint to look warmer. Wind generation expected to taper down to yearly low levels, with wind generation still projected to come online in Iowa, and as a result, as the wind generation pulls off, potentially seeing a little bit more of an expensive stack heading into the peak load. Top constraints for the summer include Dresser-Allendale, PPG Rose Bluffs, Ottumwa-Wapello, Dickinson Lakefields, and Honey Creek to Honey Creek Tap. Again, taking these all together, we are looking at kind of an overall bullish impact for Indy. And then just summarizing the major changes underway on MISO's borders, the power balance constraint expected to replace Orca this summer and drive some upside on Indy for July. Meanwhile, the changes to the PJM interface, especially the MISO interface within PJM, could supply a greater flow of imports in the real time, especially if MISO should need them, and help to maybe suppress some pricing on those peak days. So that wraps up the overall presentation here. We're just going to pause a second to review the questions that we got during the course of that. Again, in case anyone does have to go, the slides and presentation will be made available following this session. So thanks for holding on, and we'll be right back.
First question here is about the tropical outlook, and it is, what is the historical average return period?
So this is Jeff Roth, and I'm the meteorologist for the MISO desk. And basically, the historical average return period is a tool we can look at to say, on average over the historical record, how frequently does a hurricane hit a particular spot on the coast. And in our case, we're looking specifically at MISO South. And there's a small graphic in the presentation that basically highlights the Mississippi Delta there as one of the hot spots, so to speak, in the Gulf for activity, seeing a higher return period for hurricanes. So because that's within the MISO South footprint, we're cognizant of that. Although we have seen a hurricane in the recent history, 2012, which we highlighted in the demand example. So at this point, we don't feel like we're overdue because the return period being 8 years or so, we've seen one in the past 2 years. We are not. It is not an increased risk based on the return period for storms this year. But again, that's only on average over the historical record. It's not a forecast for this year.
All right. Thank you, Jefferson.
So the next question is about the ORC interface, and what is the risk to see that congestion return this summer?
So as we mentioned, we have kind of seen a shift away from ORCA and over to the sub-regional power balance constraint. The expectations for ORCA are on the marginal side. I'm not expecting, and I don't think the desk is expecting to see that crop up a lot here. Really a couple things there. First, ORCA was designed as a 2,000 megawatt threshold agreement between MISO Entergy, SCP, AUCI, and TVA. I think that's all of the ORCA signees. So there, you're already kind of only operating that limit at a half of what it was agreed upon. Secondly, I think with the power balance constraint, you have a much cleaner tool to kind of take care of any of the flows between the two regions for dispatch. So again, the risk there should be fairly minimal to see the ORCA return for summer 2014. That looks like all the time we have here for the questions. Again, if you do have any, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our IM is just MISO Genscape. My IM directly is Genscape Lauren, Lauren. We also are available by phone at 617-790-0922. But again, thank you for taking the time this afternoon during many of your lunch hours to listen to our presentation. The slide deck and the presentation should be sent out shortly, and we hope to see you soon on our next webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.